Lots to discuss, of course. We are joined by our U.S. correspondent, Simon Marks, who joins us live now from Washington. And he, of course, has got the latest coming out of the U.S. And then also, as we keep a close eye on Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana and the Reserve Bank Governor, Lesetja Kganyago, who held a briefing after a G20 meeting. Simon, a good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Lots to discuss, my goodness. But I think let's begin with what we heard from our Finance Minister and Governor, Lesetja Kganyago, about really what the highlights are that have come out of some of those G20 meetings with their counterparts.
Well, those meetings, as you know, Naledi, are still ongoing here in Washington, D.C. They are both here for the annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which, of course, are the huge financial institutions headquartered here in Washington, D.C. And we've heard from the finance minister that there was a meeting last night that included Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. There have been additional meetings today with U.S. Treasury officials, an effort by the South Africans here to try and push back on Donald Trump's tariffs and to begin the process of negotiating some kind of relief from them. He described himself as cautiously optimistic that relief might prove possible, although how quickly any kind of an agreement might be struck was not apparent. They've also been holding meetings, of course, about the G20 World Leaders Summit due to take place in South Africa in November, meeting with finance ministers and other officials from G20 member states and advancing the agenda that South Africa has for this year of its presidency of the G20, which of course include a whole basket of issues that are not front burner issues for the Trump administration, but are front burner issues for the majority of other G20 member states. And those include climate change, diversity, equity, inclusivity, again, issues that the Trump administration is actively hostile to. And the president here has accused South Africa of tilting the G20's agenda from America's perspective down a far too progressive road. But the South African government absolutely holding firm on its plans for G20. And those meetings here over the last couple of days between the finance minister, the Reserve Bank governor and their interlocutors from other G20 member states here have been designed to advance that agenda.
Yeah, interesting, because obviously for the finance minister and the governor, in these conversations with the Treasury Secretary of the U.S., what one would hear what it is that they would be negotiating. So perhaps even concessions that they are being asked to make.
Yeah, I think it's very early in this process, frankly. And just to put this into broader perspective, every single delegation here from every single country is trying to get 5 or 10 minutes with the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to advance their own case for tariffs to be reduced. Because remember that this is a global trade war that Donald Trump is waging, despite the partial U-turn that he engaged in. It was only a partial U-turn. And so countries all over the world are facing uncertainties over those trade barriers. In the case of South Africa, also, there will be a need to understand exactly where the Trump administration stands on the future of AGOA. The vast majority of observers here believe, and again, this is not just specifically about South Africa's trade benefits under the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act. It's about more broadly the future of AGOA, that the Trump administration is evincing absolutely no commitment to it whatsoever, and instead is steamrollering all of that with these so-called reciprocal tariffs that, of course, aren't really reciprocal tariffs at all. So in terms of the detail of the conversation, it's hard to understand precisely what either side is looking for, and it will be challenging, I think, for the South Africans to get clarity from the Treasury Secretary and others in his entourage. And
so much curiosity there is, Simon. Yesterday when you and I spoke, we did touch on how in Washington right now, just looking at how our team is being viewed by some of their counterparts in Washington, also one of the issues that come top of mind is the budget impasse. Well, By the time we woke up this morning here in South Africa, a 0.5 percentage point VAT hike was being reversed. And I wonder if that puts the minister, as he speaks to other ministers in Washington, in good stead, or if it puts some concern as to what one would call perhaps the credibility of our Treasury.
Well, I think it cuts both ways, doesn't it? I mean, there are so many questions, of course, about the budget impasse in South Africa that has dominated headlines there for the last several weeks, and about what it means in terms of government stability and therefore stability for international investors seeking to do business in South Africa. So there's no question that those questions will have followed the finance minister and the Reserve Bank governor here to Washington, D.C., but also the fact that that reversal was made afforded him, the finance minister, the opportunity to say, look, we're trying to put all of this behind us. So I think it's not clear that it cuts in only one direction. Yep. But the fact that the International Monetary Fund has downgraded its growth forecast for South Africa also raises questions that are definitely being asked of the delegation here.
Yeah, well, we'll get into that conversation a little bit later on with some of our other speakers. I do want to look at perhaps some of the activity that we've been seeing here, and if you can hear echoes of it in Washington, because it certainly is loud here. You've got today President Cyril Ramaphosa holding a press briefing alongside Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, then the Ukraine president needing to cut that trip short to head back home because of attacks in Kiev. Meanwhile, our president takes the podium and says, well, I've had a conversation with President Donald Trump. What's that conversation sounding like where you are?
Well, let's just deal with Ukraine first of all, because at this very moment, President Trump is speaking at the White House, where he has welcomed the Norwegian Prime Minister to Washington, D.C., and he personally has held back from criticizing Russia for those overnight attacks on Kiev, although he left it to his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who's also in the room, to describe them as horrible and unacceptable, both men insisting that the attacks themselves underscore the need for an advance towards peace in Ukraine. President Trump saying that he doesn't have any allegiance to anyone, not to Ukraine, not to Russia. He insists he's simply trying to act as an honest broker. 24 hours previously, of course, he was being very publicly critical again of President Volodymyr Zelensky. It will have been noted here that President Zelensky was in South Africa when news of those attacks by the Russians broke, then cut his visit short and headed back to Ukraine. And news of that call between President Ramaphosa and President Trump. We still don't have any kind of White House readout, any White House version of what happened in that phone call. But President Ramaphosa suggesting that the two leaders agreed to meet soon. We don't know where, we don't know when. That would certainly be a massive opportunity for President Ramaphosa to try and correct the direction of the bilateral relationship between the US and South Africa, which, of course, with the expulsion of Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, absolutely hit rock bottom. So certainly interesting that they spoke, and assuming the conversation was as productive as the South African side is suggesting, I think we will all be on the edge of our seats to see when that meeting might take place. Remember, the Americans always insist, the Trump administration claims, there is no substitute for leader-to-leader conversation. They say it about Trump's relationship with President Xi Jinping, and I suspect they will say it also about his relationship with President Ramaphosa.
Yeah, I mean, this is what's quite, I think, quite telling, right? Is you've got, for instance, the South African president having a telephonic conversation with Vladimir Putin, hosting Volodymyr Zelensky, a conversation with President Donald Trump to say, well, we're still going to sit down and have a chat. And I wonder if at all at a time like this speaks to some influence that South Africa is growing in some of these global geopolitical tugs of war.
Look, I think it's a really interesting question because South Africa's historic relationship with Moscow, which has been problematic for South Africa with previous American governments and to some extent with some in the Trump administration, from President Trump's perspective, might be seen as a positive because South Africa has this ability to speak to Vladimir Putin and now an ability to speak to Volodymyr Zelensky. And that may prove to be something, one thing that President Ramaphosa can point to that could be helpful in terms of improving that bilateral relationship. But I do think we have to wait and see, first of all, what the White House says about that conversation that took place yesterday, but almost more importantly, what is said by some of the influential right-wing voices here who have accessed President Trump's ear on South Africa, particularly vis-a-vis the Expropriation Act and the ICJ activity by South Africa against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Let's wait and see exactly how they interpret the outcome of that telephone conversation because they are still very influential in the Oval Office.
All right. Well, Simon, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for the update. Simon Marks is, of course, our correspondent speaking to us from Washington, D.C.